Like most Americans, I concur with the scientific consensus that climate change is a real global threat, and that the threat is to an extent caused, or at least greatly exacerbated, by human activity. It doesn't do much good to pretend, as some on the right still do, that the research is inconclusive or unconvincing, nor to claim that, if climate change is occurring, it doesn't pose a serious and present danger. At this point in history, the well-being of our environment should be a bipartisan concern, and a pressing one at that. In response to our climatic predicament, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has put forward, as promised, a resolution to comprehensively address climate change, an ambitious set of policy proposals that she calls the Green New Deal. Allusions to Roosevelt's 1930s New Deal are by no means accidental. She sees her own resolution as an expansion on Depression-era precedent, confronting new and diverse problems in a manner conforming to the new identity of the Democratic Party. But whatever its aspirations, the Green New Deal proposed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and recently put in writing fails to propose any practically attainable solutions to the problem. Its proposals read more like the expression of utopian imagination than a real and implementable plan to combat climate change. Among the most absurd measures, the resolution calls for the United States to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions in 10 years, to carry out a complete overhaul of the transportation system, including the elimination of all combustion engines and the construction of a high-speed rail system designed eventually to replace airplanes, and to upgrade all existing buildings. The resolution includes a plethora of proposals, but to list them all exhaustively would be redundant. It is, suffice to say, a resolution as broad in scope as it is impractical in application. Moreover, by all estimates but her own, the Green New Deal will not, as Ocasio-Cortez claims without evidence, cover its own monumental cost. But I suppose in this case, too, it is more important to be morally right than factually correct. Notably, the measures called for by Ocasio-Cortez shift the major responsibility for reducing human climate impact from the market to the centralized federal government, a break from former environmental policy, and a move consistent with new democratic tendencies. The impractical goals set by the Green New Deal become ludicrous when placed as they are in the hands of a single, bureaucratic, inefficient entity, tasked with the universal implementation of myriad objectives. Not to mention the questions of circumstantial liberty that naturally arise with respect to sweeping regulatory overhauls, such as the one here recommended. As Ocasio-Cortez herself admits, the implementation of her plan would require more than federal fiddling at the regulatory level. It would necessitate, in her words, a national mobilization, a phrase that resonates uncomfortably with echoes of the Great Leap Forward, and, though unlikely to end identically, would undoubtedly collapse in like fashion under the weight of its own ambition. However, the problem with the Green New Deal runs deeper than its failure to put realistic answers to climate change on the table. By the beginning of its third page, the resolution has already pivoted to address what it calls related crises, a basket of items that include the allegedly increasing inaccessibility of adequate healthcare, housing, transportation, and education to an undefined, quote, significant portion of Americans, as well as income inequality, racially defined economic inequities, and the conveniently but misleadingly phrased gender earnings gap to which many on the left have become so attached. In short, a critical component of the Green New Deal, as presently configured, is a supposed commitment to, in its own words, quote, counteract systemic injustices. Pleasant as the rhetoric may sound, and, to be sure, in theory, the ideal of combating social injustice is by no means inherently flawed, the notion of systemic injustices, as here presented, encapsulates a whole array of presuppositions about inequalities based on group identity, the correctives to which most often end up looking like overreaching infringements on personal liberty, sweeping anathematization of perceived hierarchic beneficiaries of assumed privilege, and impossibly ambitious attempts to absolutely equalize wherever any disparity is perceived, however subjectively it may be defined. In evoking these crises, however real they may or may not be, Ocasio-Cortez widens the scope of her climate change proposal to incorporate the rest of the social democratic platform. Not only will this alienate potential partners across the aisle, and even within her own party, this blatant co-optation of a pressing environmental issue to push a far-left identity agenda ultimately poses problems of a far more fundamental nature. For one thing, it should go without saying that tucking such an extensive range of controversial issues into a resolution explicitly pertaining to climate change requires one to take an unusual and unwieldy perspective on the question at hand. First, doing so requires one to make the assumption that the issues are in some capacity interdependent, or at least inextricable, an assumption that is entirely unfounded and never demonstrated. One would have a difficult task arguing that a changing climate somehow impacts, say, race relations in America, and yet Ocasio-Cortez makes the assertion without pause, as if her identity-driven ideology should not only be taken for granted, but taken for granted as coextensive with any solution to climate change. But more problematically, the evident conflation of this soup of progressive talking points with what is allegedly a focused response to climate change seems at least a little underhanded, one might even say sneaky. It presents a bundle of apparent societal ills, links them tenuously at best to climate change, and places the onus of fixing them on an unprecedentedly centralized vision of the federal government. In effect, the resolution collapses the better part of a new democratic agenda into 14 bullet-pointed pages, and passes it off as a reasonable solution to a danger most of us agree is real. In the words of David French, writing for the National Review, this isn't environmentalism, it's intersectionality, supplemented with a giant dose of income redistribution and economic populism. It is precisely that, and more. The Green New Deal represents a radical turn in democratic politics, disguising its core of group-based identity ideology and its twisted and untenable conception of social justice in the vestment of an environmental bill, and a pretty shoddy one at that. In the end, the resolution ratifies the coming of age of a long-standing trend on the left, perhaps a culmination induced by desperation, perhaps by a widespread emboldening of a newly vocal political class, toward radicalism in the guise of well-meaning egalitarianism and forward-looking idealism. By now we know this is what we should expect of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her ilk, the ascendant, young, hip class of new social democrats. After all, it is what they promised us on the campaign trail. But really, we should have seen this coming a long time ago.